Hello, I'm John McCarty. I'm with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I've been with BOEM, for about 9 months now, after 13 years as the Chief Landscape Architect for the Bureau of Land Management. This presentation is on a BOEM template, simply because that's where I now work. However, this is largely BLM material that's evolved over literally decades of time since the 1990s, when we first put the VRM training, 5-day training course together. And many people have contributed to the content of this presentation, including myself. Alicia Angus, I noticed, is on the call and in the session, and she too from the BLM is a major contributor to this. And in addition, I'm sharing 38 years of additional experience prior to my work with BOEM, and extends back beyond the BLM, dedicated to visually integrating large-scale transportation and energy infrastructure into natural settings, starting with my time, 10 years with the Colorado Department of Transportation. And those of you who may be familiar with the Interstate 70 Glenwood Canyon project, it's a 13-mile stretch of highway through a very difficult terrain, very scenic
Excuse me,
environment.
John. I need you to speak up just a little bit. To be a little bit more clear, please.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's better.
That's better? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, but maybe pulling the speaker closer to me. Anyway, it's a 13 stretch a mile. Doesn't take long to build 13 miles, maybe a year or two, but this one actually took 15 years to complete. The objective of the unit is to share Lynn asked me to share research on that's been conducted by Argonne National Laboratory on the visibility of large energy infrastructure, and then provide an overview on concepts and methods and techniques of design projects in a way that minimize adverse visual impacts. This presentation at the BLM training course is a 90-minute presentation for the design principles, and it's another hour to talk about this visibility research, and we're going to compress this into 60 minutes, so hold on, people. It's going to be divided into 5 different sections. Discuss the visibility research, share some sources of information on developing recreation facilities to sit into the natural environment, sources for best management practices on reducing visual impacts from energy development, and then the overview on design principles, and then we'll go through a few examples. If we run out of time, we'll get to that in a minute. We'll start with the research on visibility of energy research. I want to credit the different agencies that have funded this research at Argonne. The Bureau of Land Management has been a major contributor to this research, Department of Energy, the National Park Service, as well as my current agency, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, before I joined up. The research was conducted by Bob Sullivan, the Principal Visual Resource Scientist at Argonne National Laboratory, who just recently retired. If there's anybody in the audience who has an interest in doing this kind of work, please contact me and I'll connect you with the people at Argonne National Laboratory. This is a sampling of the research. We're going to talk about the first 2 on the list, but the most important thing on this slide is the website, the Visual Resource Clearinghouse, which is a website sponsored and funded by the Bureau of Land Management and hosted by Argonne National Laboratory. There's the link. If you don't get it and you want it, my contact information is available. Get a hold of me. We'll start with the wind visibility research. What you look on this slide is a rating table, visibility rating table on the left-hand side. Bob Sullivan built this table based on the BLMs, if you're familiar with it, the BLM's Visual Resource Management class objectives, which class objective 1 is preservation of landscape, no character change, or very, very minimal, to VRM class 4, which allows for major character change, with moderate and minimal in between with VRM class 2 and 3. This is pattern after that. Visibility level 1 is similar to BLM's VRM class 1. Visibility level 6 is consistent with the VRM class 4. He's added another visibility level wedged between the BLM's 3 and 4 and 2 and 3, just to give some more flexibility in the rating. And this research was done in eastern Wyoming and eastern Colorado, where the road grid is such that you can travel in a straight line away from the wind turbine projects in any direction you want to, north, south, east, west. And so he studied this incrementally in 1 mile increments, and he's given the map. So if you want to go out and repeat the research and understand and test it to see if you agree with his conclusions, you can. And he's built these scatter charts that with the visibility rating on the left-hand side and the miles away on the x-axis. And he looked at the different projects. Each project has its own scatter chart. It also looked at variations in visibility, whether it's skyline or whether there's a landscape backdrop, and also in consideration of different viewing angles. Not different viewing angles, but different sun angles illuminating the turbines at different times of day. The reason we did this research is because at one time it was the developers, this goes back about 10, 15 years ago, developers were claiming that the visibility of wind turbines stopped at 5 miles, which is the BLM's threshold between middle ground and far ground distances, while the public was claiming they could be seen as far away as 60 to 100 miles away. And so we needed some research to demonstrate what the true visibility was. And Bob Sullivan's research in this particular circumstance, this particular environment, revealed that the time you begin to see those wind turbines, and mostly because you can begin to faintly see some rotation of the blades, it's about 30 miles away, 30 to 33 miles away. So that became the basis by which we would establish the affected visual environment, even though the visual impact is non-existent at that distance away. Talk about electrical transmission visibility, very much the same kind of thing, except with the transmission visibility, we often look at transmission as a single unit. The wires, the towers, the whole thing is a single unit, or it's multiple units collated together. But Bob's research broke down the components of the transmission line and looked at those elements that tend to show up. He broke it down as what he looked at. This is the anatomy of a transmission tower and transmission line, and what's circled in yellow are the focus of his study. The tower itself, the conductors, which are the wires that carry the electrical load, and the insulators which separate the conductors from the tower. And the different transmission in the towers, he doesn't just look at a single tower, he looks at all the different kinds of towers that are used, the size, the type, lattice tower, monopole, and the different sizes based on the load that they carry. So we don't, usually when we think of visibility of the transmission, we don't break it down into components, but the conductors themselves can actually become quite more visible than the towers. And during certain times of day, the glow that you see in those conductors is not because of the load it's carrying, but because of the sun angle reflecting off of the surface. And so it's a very easy thing to deal with, but you have, if you're in a position to be either commenting from the public or if you're a regulatory agency, it's just a simple mitigation requirement to use non-specular wires that do not have this high reflective property. Wires can still be seen, but they don't show up like specular wires do. And then insulators. Insulators come in 3 different types: glass, ceramic, and polymer. Each have their own set of advantages, and it's why the industry uses these 3 interchangeably for various different reasons. But 1 of them, 2 of them will glow like you see in the picture. Especially the glass insulators really show up. Ceramic will also have high reflective properties to it, but the polymers are non-reflective. And this is just a picture of polymer insulators. I'm not advocating that you use red or even light gray. Darker gray is a better color. but these are available, and they are functional in every situation. And if they're resistant to wanting to use them because their preferred one happens to be glass, at least have the conversation if you're in a highly visible area that you want to reduce the visibility of the transmission line. One of the things that the study does not go into is the right-of-way clearing and vegetation management, but the study doesn't go into that. But if you do everything you can do to reduce the visibility of the transmission line, the vegetation, the nature of the vegetation management, especially through a wooded area, is the one thing that will really make it stand out. So there are treatments you can do along that. Erin DeGudis in her presentation tomorrow is going to get into deeper into that. So I'm going to stick with what I'm going to talk about and let Erin share with you some strategies. And she's from, she works for the transmission industry to give you some ideas about their limitations in vegetation management and what can be accomplished. Same thing here. Bob prepared these scatter charts with the visibility rating on the y-axis and the miles away on the y-axis, and or the visibility ratings on the y-axis and the miles away on the x-axis, looking at the different tower types and doing a comparison between the tower types. So the idea here is to entice you to look at this research, because it's really important to understand the visible properties that then enables you, if you're working with an energy provider, or if you're working with a regulatory agency, that not everybody knows this information, but if you do and you're part of the conversation, whether as a member of the public or a cooperating agency or within your agency yourself, this gives you the information that you can have an informed conversation with the utility company on options. So the first publication, if we don't get through this presentation, everything I'm going to talk about today is in this publication, again, generated by Argonne National Laboratory, working with the BLM. And it's at the same website I already gave you, but here's the direct link to download it. When you go to the website, if you go to the home page, on the top of the home page is a bunch of like links along the top and this website goes into all the different federal agency visual resource policies and procedures. So it's a one-stop shopping, again, sponsored, funded by the BLM. And on the far right is documents, which is an exhaustive library of information. This is the top one in that pull down. It's a 350-page list of different BMPs, and they're like one-page explanation. It's a great resource, well underutilized, and encourage everybody on the phone to access it. The other thing I want to share with you, especially as you talk about those facilities that the agencies build, not that other people build under permit, but that we build for, like, for instance, river use support, whether that's a boat launch access, or a parking lot, or a day use facility to support the day use of the river, are these two documents. The first one on the left was developed by the U.S. Forest Service, called the Built Environment Image Guide. It talks about the different regions across the U.S. Forest Service and the architectural vernacular of that area of the country. So it goes from like Southeast United States to Northwest United States and everything in between, including Alaska and Hawaii. And so it gives you that kind of architectural character that fits into that location for the Forest Service to use, and it works well for all the other agencies as well. And then the next one is the BLM's built environment, or guidelines for a quality built environment. That was the project manager was Alicia. She's talking later on today as a part of this, and developed a fantastic with more detail on the particular kinds of facilities that we put in on BLM land. So what to know is the Built Environment Image Guide by the Forest Service was the first one. BLM was inspired by that to develop it. And one of the primary goals was not to repeat what the Forest Service did, but to be a companion document to the Forest Service. And the Forest Service is on the project team to make sure that they do work well together. So there's some URLs to download it. If you don't have access to the PowerPoint afterwards, just call me. I'll get you, or email me and I'll connect you with it. As we get into the visual design principles, the first thing we need to talk about is how do you read the landscape? And this is a term borrowed from, again, the Forest Service and from their scenery management system, but it's called visual absorption capability. It's basically looking at the landscape to understand what the opportunities that the visual variety of the landscape has to deliver to help integrate and cite different facilities. Of course, it's important that the facilities you put in any given landscape are in scale with the natural features of that landscape. And the idea here is the more visual variety the landscape has, the more likely, the more ability it has to absorb those visual changes. Unlike lands without visual variety, with very low visual variety, it's very difficult to integrate features in. This wind farm, for instance. Vertical features, large, tall vertical features, pushing 500 feet on a horizontal plane, it's hard to integrate those. There's not a whole lot you can do. So I'm not advocating that we should put all of our stuff that we want to build in our most scenic areas. It's just to understand the opportunity the visual variety has to offer when something does get proposed to be placed in various different settings and what the limitations may be. So the three basic principles in the design fundamentals is proper siting and location, reduction of unnecessary disturbance, and repetition of the landscape character elements that both Julie McGrew and Mark Mara went through yesterday in the introductory discussions and inventorying of the landscape. We're going to start with proper siting and location. And this is really where visual absorption capability really comes into play to kind of understand the opportunities. Looking at the landscape, looking at the topographical opportunities. What's the nature of the vegetation in the landscape and how can we integrate it in? And also being mindful of visual sensitivity of a given area. For instance, you wouldn't want to put a feature right on a scenic overlook, a pull off the road and with interpretive displays and a view of the beautiful scenery. You wouldn't want to put something right in the viewing plane of that. Or looking at the landscape features. Mark talked about the different types of landscapes yesterday in his unit on language of landscapes about, you have panoramic landscapes and you have enclosed landscapes and you have canopy landscapes, you have focal landscapes. You wouldn't want to put something right at the focal point of the landscape. And we also have feature landscapes. You wouldn't want, if you have a feature like say Devil's Tower or something else that has a named feature in a landscape because it draws the attention as a part of the scenery and maybe white people go there, you wouldn't want to put your facility right next to that. So it's reading the landscape to understand the potential of where people look and also the character to integrate things in. And I always like to say is always think about it as not fitting the landscape to the project, but fitting the project to the landscape. It's very easy just to move dirt and put something in place as opposed to actually reading the landscape to understand the true opportunity. And to make an example of that, these tanks here, they do what we call penetrating the ridge line or ridge lining or sky lining, where it rises above the ridge line and part of the backdrop is the skyline. When these were placed, they didn't really look at it. It probably would have been better to bring it even closer to the highway so that it would be below the ridge line, or better yet, reading the landscape and seeing this foreground ridge line and the back ridge line. Obviously, there's a depression back behind that they could have moved this oil and gas facility further back and used the topography to conceal it. It's also the idea, and so it's best to stay off the ridge lines and bring the feature below the ridge line, or if you're up above the ridge line, pushing it further back. You can see the tank here in the picture. It's hard to miss, especially given the color and also the road that leads to it. This is a good placement of the tank, possibly because doesn't break the ridge line and skyline, but the road directs your eye to it. A better place for the road may have been to move it up. carry it off the intersection and put a dog leg into it that's out of view to lead to the tank, as opposed to being an axis that guides your eye to the tank. And then a little splash of color and relocation of that road would have made a huge difference there in that particular site. Using topography, I'm showing here the drill rig, the derrick, which is a temporary feature, just for those of you not familiar with oil and gas, to drill to the resource, and then they put in the facilities to operate and produce the resource. So this is a temporary feature. We use this to just demonstrate that they chose not in front of the topography within view, but put it behind the topography, reading the lines and the forms of the landscape to fit the project in. Here's a water tank taking advantage of the vegetation. This is not too far away from where I live. Actually, it's about 3 miles from where I live in Colorado. And it's along a main highway. It's about 500 feet perpendicular to the highway. And I go by this all the time, but never see it. The only time I even think about it is when I give this presentation. And there's a road to it. You don't see the road. And so there's no access to guide your eye to it. And they preserved the vegetation and took advantage of the vegetation to conceal it, and then painted it at an appropriate color. So reduction of unnecessary disturbance. And we're not saying no disturbance, but unnecessary disturbance, as you see here. We call this side casting. And this oil and gas operator, which fortunately this is not on BLM land. You don't see this very often on BLM land anymore, but this is on state land where they kind of lost their sense of good practices, and they just tossed the material down the hillside and extended the visual footprint of otherwise a concealed pad, and placed the tanks right on the edge where you can see here's the pad. There's plenty of opportunity to have set this further back and not have casted that material down the slope. So this is probably our best example of unnecessary disturbance, and easily avoidable. Often when we build our linear features, the developer and the construction contractor likes to use the full width of the right of way, but often they're given more right of way than they actually need to construct. So it's understanding the constructability requirements of the project on how to reduce the visual footprint. Because once this gets repaired, you'll still end up with the revegetation, probably a stripe through the landscape. And the windrow of material makes it easy to then backfill the pipe, but it just extends that linear stripe much further, much greater width than is often necessary. The Rob Sweeten out of our Utah State office has worked a lifetime for the BLM and is an aficionado of visual resources. And he was working on a pipeline with Questar. And Questar, working with them, instead of having that continual windrow of material, they identified stockpile areas. Okay, it requires a little bit of extra time, because instead of building that windrow, that's very easy just to dig out and dump it on the other side of the trench, they actually have to tram it to a location to stockpile it. However, the other thing that it does do here is by identifying certain locations for stockpiling, it gives the opportunity to also undulate the vegetated edge of the right-of-way. What will catch your eye is that unnatural straight line of vegetation along an excavated a right-of-way to place in the pipeline, even though the pipeline's out of view. Where it's located is highly in view, but by undulating that vegetation line makes all the difference in the world. And here's a snapshot of a small segment that is hard to tell where the line is. I think it's probably kind of intuitive since it's in the middle of the picture, but you can see the benefit of undulating that vegetation line on both sides of the right-of-way. And then here they took it a step further of tickling out the rock and repeating the surface texture that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. And to just basically, if you're driving by this, it's out of sight, it's out of mind, even though it's right in your view plane. That's a good example from Rob Sweeten. And he has many more to share. And then the other option to minimize unnecessary disturbance is just simply to fence your contractor in. And if you have other elements within your site that of the fenced in area and you want to protect it, just label it to be protected and assign a value to it, like we did with this particular tree, along with many other trees on the Glenwood Canyon project that I mentioned earlier, that if they take it out by accident or intentionally, or if they happen to scar it up, it comes with a fee, comes with a cost. And when they scarred this tree up, it cost them, it happened once. They don't like to waste their money. So now we're going to get into the core of stuff of form, line, color, and texture. How are we doing on time, Lynn?
You're doing well. You have plenty.
Okay, well, I'll take it all up then.
You have about a half an hour.
I'm sorry, what?
You have about a half an hour.
Oh, great. Repetition of form, line, color, and texture. Those are the landscape character elements. That's reading the landscape. That's part of visual absorption capability to understand the different lines and what the colors are and the palette of colors and the lines, the forms to identify and repeat and the features that you're going to put out into a landscape. You can see this was done very well. Repetition of color. I'm going to talk about color first. The reason I'm going to talk about color first because it's fundamentally the easiest out of form, line, color, and texture to accomplish. It's a matter of simply putting some paint on it, right? We'll talk more about that. It's a little bit more than just that. But as you can see here, there was kind of an idea here to repeat the color of the sky. And obviously that didn't quite work quite very well from looking at this particular viewpoint from the highway. We always say, don't try to repeat the color of the sky because the sky is always changing. So you may pick a particular color that's really good on that day, on that year, in that month, and it happened to be that blue. And so you picked it. And then the rest of the time, ever since then, it's never been quite that blue or it's been cloudy. And you can see here, there's a cloudy sky. Even in Wyoming, it's cloudy skies. And these are elements of the landscape. So it's better to repeat the colors of the landscape as opposed to repeating colors of the heavens that are, again, ever changing. So color is a powerful visual design tool. Color is increasingly effective in direct proportion to the distance it is away from the viewer. And eventually all colors at a certain distance at about 5 miles away, or even maybe a little closer, mute to a basic gray. But the closer you are, the more effective it will be. But at the same time, as it turns gray in the background, so does everything else. So it changes with everything else. And we have this tendency that when we're in the desert, we want to use desert browns, which are light colors, not a good choice. And when we're in more lush landscapes, we tend to look at the landscape and pick the colors, the green colors that catch our eye. And so if you capture the green colors that catch your eye, like I'm looking out my window and I see a light colored tree, with light colored green leaves. And so if I paint this tank the color of those lighter greens, it will just be a green tank in the landscape as opposed to something else. So light colors of the landscape advance towards people and gives it more distinction. And what we're looking for are those shadow colors that recede from view. So instead of the light color, the surface of the tree leaf or the vegetation leaf that's reflecting the sun, which is what's catching our eye, look at the shadow part of the landscape and repeat those kind of grayish, greenish, darker colors. Because then that tank, instead of looking like a green tank, just looks like it's part of the shadow matrix of the landscape. And recedes greatly from view. BLM has a color chart. There's 9 colors. You used to have 2 charts, one that was produced in 1987, another one in 2000, to give some more colors. And those 2 creators of those charts and myself and one other person got together and we went out and field tested all these colors and came up with 7 that actually worked and then added 2 more to the palette. So for quite a while, we were putting a lot of colors out there from those 2 charts that really weren't working very well. And through the research, found out which ones they were. So the idea here is to match the color to the landscape. But again, look for the shadow darker colors to blend in so it appears more of that shadowed area of the landscape. We have this tendency, I'll just say, it's really, really easy to pick the wrong color, but it's not hard to pick the right color. Here's an example. Often we hear pick earth tone colors. Earth tone colors are like the soil colors of the earth as opposed to vegetation colors. And a lot of times we pick up on the rock or the soils and we repeat it in the structures we put in, thinking that blends in the best. But again, it's the lighter colors. And so we just have, it's an earth tone color, but you can really, it really does pop in the landscape. It's better if you're putting in a vertical structure to get clues from the vertical vegetation within the landscape. And again, I will continue to say, look at the shadowed area. Here's another one that's using a little bit darker color, and it's not bad, but it does pretty much stand out in amongst the color palette and the shadows of that landscape. Perhaps human green from our color chart would have been a little bit better choice. So again, you may be well-intentioned, but it may be that the color that you choose that color may be in the landscape, may not be the best, most optimal color. Again, our facilities along the river corridors or other bodies of water, I have absolutely nothing wrong with these colors. I think they look great, but they do show up. They are, nice, soft, pastel type colors. But again, when you look at the background, they don't really blend in very well. So if you want to make them stand out, this is not a bad example. But if what we're trying to do is de-emphasize their presence and let the landscape be the dominant part of the view, is again choosing a color that gets that result. And here we have shadow gray on the structures, and the picnic tables are the Sudan brown. And if you look back in the distance, you see these. See, when you're in the foreground and you have a properly colored tree, you can still see them, right? But the more distant features completely disappear from view. No one knows. So we're going to talk a little bit about transmission now. Talk about treatment of the towers. And there's two basic types, lattice and monopoles. And we also have H frames, which are like double monopoles with the support member in between. And lattice towers, I typically think they're the better ones for like the public landscape, if you can set them back away from like the roadway that they often follow, and or any other viewing location back anywhere from a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile, and properly color treated. And we'll talk about proper color treatment here in a minute. But move them back because they're transparent. And if they're properly color treated, it only takes about a half a mile away with a landscape backdrop for them to basically just blend in. They're hard to see. If there's not a backdrop, they're easy to see. If you're going to be close to the roadway, monopoles are probably the preferred option, because while they're solid and very, very, therefore not as transparent as a lattice tower, when they're right next to the road, the lattice tower is very conspicuous and it requires a larger base to it for the 4 feet, where the monopole has a very small surface footprint. Monopoles work really well in built environments too, because they have a smaller footprint and they look more architecturally, along with the other built environment texture features, street lamps and parking lot lights, things like that. These linear vertical features, they tend to repeat those elements. Anyway. The lattice towers in a built environment begin to give it more of an industrial feel. If not, lattice towers, while they can be hard to see, not very far away, and these were properly color treated, these right here would not be easy to see where the ones right next to the roadway would be. But there's easy solutions. Here's a study that was done back in the early 70s, if not the 60s, where they were building a transmission line, which would never be this close today, next to an already existing power line that wasn't color treated and stands out, and you can even see the insulator here. It looks like a beige or yellow. And the other power line, when they put it through, you can see the conductors and you see the insulator. And it's very difficult to see the transmission tower. So it's easy, and we're probably only a couple 100 feet away from that tower, and it's very difficult to see. Improper or conventional color treatment or treatment of monopoles can really show up, are very bright in the landscape, especially at an afternoon sun or early morning sun angle. They just pop. And I'm pretty close to these, but I took a picture about 9 miles away, and they're very conspicuous at this time of day in the Mojave Desert. So you have some options here. Here's conventional galvanization. Here's special treated galvanization, which is basically just giving it another galvanizing bath. You put it either, the two options I understand is you can either leave it in the vat for a longer period of time to build up a thicker coating, or they pull it out of the bath and hover it over to dry, and then they dip it back in again for another bath or multiple baths to get the effect. And you can see the difference. At certain sun angles, this is going to really glare. This won't. The treatment on the left-hand side won't. There's also another color treatment that you'll hear from the industry. And I've heard this. You never want to say, please paint them a different color. We don't like the galvanized options. We would like to have, in this case, shell green. And they will tell you, well, if we do that, we have to repaint them every year, or every 5 years. We'll have to shut down the line. We'll have to paint them. It's very labor intensive, and you're not going to get anywhere. You want to tell them color treat it, because painting is a method. That's like taking out a bucket of Sherwin-Williams and slapping some latex paint on it. You don't want to tell them how to do it. You just want to tell them to color treat it. In this case, this is powder coating. Powder coating is not painting. Powder coating is powder coating. And this is a long conversation, because they told us you have two options. You can do galvanized, and we can darken it up if you like it, like the picture I just showed you, or we can put in Corten weathering steel. And sometimes Corten weathering steel is the right choice. But in this case, it wouldn't work in this particular environment. And we went round and round, and Brandon Colvin, our state lead in Arizona at the time for visual resources, stuck to his gun. Can you still hear me, Lynn? I don't know. I think I moved away from the microphone. But they stuck to their gun, and they got shadow gray. And the monopole really works because it repeats the form of the sorrel cactus as well as the color. And I have other pictures if we get to the projects. Repetition of form. You can see the form here. Instead of a tall water tank, they put in a more horizontal water tank to kind of repeat the top and appear to be an extension of the mound. And I believe they also partially buried it. Here's the fence line, but this looks like it's a fill line for a berm, which ended up being just an extension of the lower slope. It may have been a better color choice, perhaps, and they could have maybe added some more trees to interrupt that horizontal line on the top to better blend it in. But we like to point to this as a good example of repeating repetition of form. Again, it's repeating and extending the form of the mound that they put the water tank on, in case you can't see it. Different approach in this picture in this water tank. I don't know if you see it right off the bat, but for the sake of moving forward, there it is. What do they do here? They repeated the form of the trees and the color of the trees. So when the trees that they planted at the base get to the mature size that you see these trees, they'll go completely unnoticed. And if you're driving by, would probably largely go unnoticed today because of approximating the form. Instead of putting a wide tank up there, they put in a narrow tank, probably increase its height for capacity. Repetition of line. Often we just, because we have a flat landscape, just run across it. But when it comes to all landscapes, have contour. And if they had just deviated out and put it like a dog leg, like I talked earlier, right where this contour breaks, brought it more out and then brought back into their destination, it would have broken up that line into maybe a couple of different broken discernible lines, but you wouldn't have had this axis that guides your view all the way down and very prominent. It divides the landscape into two hemispheres. So whenever interject curvature to the roadway or to other linear features to break that up. Here's another example of what we represent a job well done. A road that follows the natural contours of the line, repeats the line of the topography, repeats the line of the ridge line next to the road, as well as looking at the road from a distance, which is a scenic overlook, repeats also the color and the lines of the other features within the landscape and the landform. And then also the experience from when you're on the road. If you're repeating the lines of the road and as of the landscape and embody it in the road as you view it away from the road, the view of the road from within the road is accentuated as well. It gives it sense. It gives you a sense that you're flowing with the landscape, and because of the curvature, it's protected foreground natural attributes to the edge of the road, bringing the landscape to the edge of the road always leads to a more pleasurable experience. Reading the lines, there's obviously lots of things we can point at this project and find problems with, but what's good about it is they put in low profile tanks that are more horizontal, fitting in within the lines, the various different lines of the landscape. We have lines all the way through this landscape. And taking the time to read those lines and not just paying attention to the silhouette of the landscape, but doing an inventory of all these lines. And obviously this placement of that tank would have been much better if it had been placed here. And why they put it there, I have no idea. But this, with a little bit of color treatment and putting up a short 4-foot barrier fence along the edge of that disturbance zone, or doing interim reclamation inside, would have made a huge amount of difference, because they, in this case, were probably in an uncanny kind of way repeating the lines of landscape. Same thing up here in the corner with these tanks right there. So it's reading the landscape, understanding the opportunity to visually absorb, and carrying that at the distance. If, going back to that, if we got line covered and we deal with color, and we got a little bit of things going on with the form by using low profile tanks, your project will essentially eliminate from view, or the project you're concerned about coming in within your sacred area, your view plane, will go largely unnoticed. So it's not just dealing with one. This would be, trying to deal with all four: form, line, color, and texture. Sometimes it's only color you can work with. Repetition of the texture. Repeating texture means matching the overall character of the landscape, not just what's immediately adjacent to it. So it's reading the landscape, looking at all the different kind of various textures. And of course, we can't build these kinds of facilities anymore because it's cost prohibitive. But if you can use natural materials found locally, that's obviously an ambitious idea. It leads to really fantastic outcomes. But thinking about texture and looking at this picture in the foreground, we have some rather medium textured vegetation. And then right behind it, you have the crop area, which is a very fine textured vegetation. And then you have the coarseness of the structures and some coarseness in the vegetation back behind. And then a very coarse texture in the landform. And right in the middle of it, we put in a tank that has a very smooth texture. And we don't typically add texture to tanks, but one of the things that smooth textures will produce this distinct shadow line. So to carry it to another treatment, to a water tank that's in the middle of this picture, we're much further away than the previous tank example, but what they did here is they repeated the color, but they also textured the tank, so you don't see that line. And the tank is right in the center portion of the picture. And you can see they repeated the form of the landscape, repeating these forms of these darkened cliffs. They repeated the color of those shadowed cliffs. But if it was a smooth texture, you would probably see a shadow line. You don't, because Rob, again, this is another Rob Sweeten project. He had it textured, and that diffuses the light shining on a fine texture and reduces its reflectivity because it's reflecting light in all different directions as opposed to one primary direction. I mentioned the Glenwood Canyon project. This is just one little piece of it, but there was a previous scar. We built the project up to match the grade line, the old highway, to match the grade line with an interstate template. And we had a lot of old scars. This whole thing was gutted out. And often what we do in those situations is we hog in the material, we regrade the slope, we put down the topsoil, we seed it, we watch it germinate, it looks good, and you have this green blotch in amongst the landscape that draws your eye. But we're being much more sensitive and repeating the texture of the landscape and seeing that we had this boulder talus run down here. And instead took the time. It was a little bit more expensive than just regrading it and seeding it, but it took some time to do the boulder placement, which was now maybe about 38 years ago. And it stands the test of time. And nobody, when they go by it, ever knew that this was a gutted out slope at one time. However, if we had done conventional approach to and not repeated the natural textures and colors of the landscape, it would be a scar today, even though it would be vegetated. Just share this document with you. It's a study. It's a 14-year research project that I started working on as a contractor. Then when I joined the BLM as the chief landscape architect, carried it to its completion. It was done by OTAC and worked with Lieutenant Colonel Timothy R. O'Neill from the military, who, when he started with the military since the 70s, his whole life was about perfecting camouflage technology as a science instead of an art. And also with hyperstealth biotechnology out of Canada. And if you're looking at this, it seems kind of silly. You can see the test panels that we did develop to choose patterns and colors. But what you probably don't see is there's actually two more panels, one right there and another one right here in the picture. This is not color treatment. It's using color. I should say, this is not repeating colors of the landscape. This is using color to repeat textures of the landscape. Since this is putting texture on putting faux texture on a smooth textured feature, its range is only effective between about a quarter mile, because anything closer look really odd, and about 3/4 to a mile away, because since it's a smooth textured surface with a bunch of different colors on it, once you get about a mile away, it just fades to one color. So it's just not worth the investment. This is more of a conventional approach that people, if you hear camouflage, this is what you think of. This is the science approach, where you're looking at the pixelated patterns of the landscape and repeating those pixelated patterns. This is an hour presentation into itself. If it resonates with you, get a hold of me. I'll be happy to carry you through it. Now we're going to go through some project examples. I don't know, I'm going to guess, because my clock was a little bit off, that we have about 10 minutes left. So
We have about 10 minutes, just under.
okay. With that, I'm going to rush through these, but if people have questions, go ahead and start populating. Your questions are more important probably than the examples, because it's just repeating a lot of what I just said. So if you have some questions that you'd rather spend the 10 minutes on, I'm okay with that. So I'll just continue until Lynn stops me. We're not going to talk about the storage facility. What we're talking about here is this water tank you see behind that's a water tank for Basalt, Colorado. Zooming in, I'm just really proud of the outcome that the Glenwood Springs office, now the Silt office, accomplished here. As you can see here, here's the tank. The tank is a normal size, probably a bit of a low profile tank, but you only see about 25% of the tank, because the tank is hidden by this berm that they built. And the berm has a little bit of a slope to it that repeats the slopes you see in the lines you see here of the landscape. Plus it repeats, the revegetation repeats the colors and the forms of the vegetation of the landscape. So it just looks like a finger extension of the sagebrush area into the gamble oak and pinyon juniper vegetation here. And then it matches up with this finger of sage that runs on down. There's also a road in here. So talk about placement. It's very good placement of the road and the tank. You don't even see the road. And then they picked covert green, maybe Yuma green or Yuma green or shadow gray might have darkened it up a little bit more. But this is another tank that's near where I live. I go by it. You don't see it unless you're looking for it. And when I knew about it, I was looking for it. It took me about a day to figure out where in the world it was. So this is a really good example. This is our go-to project. Aaron's going to talk a little bit about this project. The towers here, the transmission tower monopoles are here. There's always a discussion. Should we put it next to the road or should we put the transmission line away from the road? Here they put it next, co-located with the road, which I think was the best choice. And this is along Interstate 70. I've been by this a million times and never really picked up on it until I worked for the BLM and I started paying attention to things like this. But the form repeats, although larger scale, repeats the forms of the trees. And while it's much larger than any one individual tree, given the layers of the trees on up the slope, it fits in really well. Plus it repeats the color. The other thing it does is there is a cleared right-of-way. You just don't see it because they preserved the vegetation as a curtain to shield, not only to bring some foreground, maintain foreground line color and natural line color and texture to repeat, but also conceal the presence of the clearing. So this is practicing good site location, minimal surface disturbance, preservation of vegetation, repetition of form, line, color, and texture. And it's hard to see. So, and this was done in 1976. So when they tell you, we really don't have any other options other than Core-10 steel or galvanized, you can say, well, now wait a minute. You used to, why don't you still now? These were powder coated. Test of time, lasted test of time, 45 years, still looks great. A little bit faded under certain light conditions. It's no need to repaint them or recolor treat them. This is an oil and gas project where they preserve the vegetation, they repeated the color of the vertical vegetation, minimize site disturbance, and when you're about a half a mile away from this project, it just dissolves into the landscape along with all the other oil and gas facilities because of how they've respected the vegetation and took advantage of site placement. Here's Brandon's project again. You can see it from a different viewing angle, and the roadway is down here. Here's this guy. The roadway is down here. And they've moved it from the road, and you see how the line comes down and eventually crosses the road. But even though when you're looking at it, and that's your thing, is to look at transmission lines, they pop up. But if you're just passing by because of the repetition of color and form and the minimizing of surface to surface, you can still see some work going on along part of the right of way. It really does a lot better job than if they had done what they stuck with was the, sorry, I'm getting a message from another meeting, but than if it was galvanized. It would have been a completely different outcome. Here are Core-10 steel. You hear me say Core-10 steel is not a panacea to transmission lines. Be guarded about where you use it, but there are places where it works great. And it does work great here because what's happening here is it's repeating the color of the dark vertical striations of the landform. So it does, when you're traveling through there, it just dissolves in as another striation. I would normally advocate for a lattice tower, but in this case, this was the right choice. A monopole, Core-10 weathering steel, it blends in very well. Communication towers. These drums, if you don't specify it, will always be white. And the Forest Service contacted me. This is a Medicine Bow in Wyoming. They were reauthorizing their permit for this communication facility, and they asked them to paint the facility. Shadow, I think, Yuma green. to match the background color. So when you look up there, you're going to see it because of the form extension of the mountain. But if you're driving by, if it's white, it catches the corner of your eye and you're going to look at it. If it's color treated, it's not going to catch your eye. A very easy solution. Often we look at the core features of the project and we miss things like the fence that goes around it. And if it's galvanized, which it often is, it's got a pop. There's easy solutions like Natina, which is a surface coloration. You can require polyvinyl coated fencing. You can put it in a soft acid wash to tone down the sheen of the fences. So there's many things to do to avoid this kind of glaring that just really accentuates the presence of a bunch of other stuff behind it that was color mitigated. So in closing, encourage you to go to this website to look at the different visual resource information, but especially the research on visibility, and also to download the BMPs, the publication on energy, visual reduction of energy facilities. And just remember the 3 arching design principles: selecting the best site, looking at the visual absorption capability the landscape provides to you, minimizing the surface disturbance, and designing the features to repeat the natural forms, lines, colors, and textures of the landscape. And just to reemphasize, color is the easiest, and it's very easy to pick the wrong color. But it's not hard to pick the right color. So with that, Led, I'll pass it back to you. I heard some noise. I don't know if that was my Teams thing popping at me or if you got some questions.
No, actually, there aren't any questions right now. We've got a great job comment. I just have one question, and that's, I don't know if it's answerable, but if you have competing elements like form and lines and textures, and the solutions don't always blend, what would you say is the one thing that you have to focus on?
Well, again, if you have a feature that's difficult to modify its form, like, there's a lot of things that's hard to modify the form because that whole thing of form follows function. Like tanks, you have the opportunity to put in a low profile tank, but obviously you can't change the overall cylindrical type shape. Again, color is what to go with. Often it's just something's always going to be, whatever you put out there, they're going to put some sort of protective covering on that feature. They're going to powder coat it, or they're going to paint it. They're going to do something to it. They're going to galvanize it. And Mike Miller is going to talk tomorrow, I think, about different ways to vary the color of galvanizing. So, when we were talking about different, when we were getting that pushback that we can only galvanize or we can do core 10 steel, I contacted a different manufacturer and quizzed them and got the scoop. And that's Mike Miller, who's talking tomorrow. And he said, we're actually looking at ways to change that galvanizing treatment. But the color, Linus, color is always the go-to thing to look at. And then the texture is probably the next thing. And the other thing is reading the lines. You may not be able to do anything with the line of a feature you're going to put out there because it may be blocky, but it's reading the landscape to see where to fit it in the lines of the landscape so it doesn't penetrate those lines, and then treat the right kind of color. Does that make sense?
Yes, it all makes sense to me for sure. We got a question about, has there been recent data studies done on camouflaging comm towers as trees? And I know there's a number of them here in Virginia. Some are successful, some aren't. And I was just wondering, so the question from one of our people was, has there been any research on their success?
Well, I like to say, I don't know if there's written research, but I can tell you the 14 years I've had with the VRM course, the 20 years plus that Alicia Angus, who's on this, has had with the VRM training course. And we've talked about all these things. We have our observations, and this is what I'll share with you. Everything needs to be in scale. Those transmission towers, monopoles in that forested environment right next to the road would look different repeating the form line color, or would look different if they were monopoles with color treated, if that was a flat landscape with evergreen trees on it, but it was against a backdrop, a vertical backdrop, where that form is continually being repeated up the hill. Now, if you go out there and you happen to have some evergreen trees, so you put in one of those 400-foot tall or 200-foot tall trees, it looks weird. I mean, you can't miss it. It draws attention to it. And what we have found is it's better, instead of putting in these monumental trees, to stick with the small visual footprint of the linear tower and color treat it to match the landscape. They had this I had a call from the administrator of Rappahannock County there in Virginia. And they had, I forgot what the name of the town, but I'd say Layton's head moving. So maybe she knows the town of the, not the name of the town, but the county, I forget. But they contacted me and said, you know, we've been talking to the National Park Service that there's got to be a better color. We think we're going to color it brown. But they said, you know, call the guy at the BLM. Somebody had been through the VRM training. They said, you know, they think about this stuff on a regular basis. Give them a call. I get this phone call and I'm like, here, I'll send you our color chart. I had said, you know, looking at the landscape that you're in, because I could see it on the screen, you know, well, there was actually there was a newspaper article, and the town was all, or the community was all up and upset because they were putting this, you know, white tower that's already actually in place. They put it in there and people were upset about it. And so they're going to make them go back and color treat it. And they're going to put in brown. I pointed out to them in a very diplomatic way that, you know, brown may not be the same choice. Very similar reasons that I sometimes question the use of Corten rather than steel. And suggested that they look at the Yuma green. They're all happy now. They went in there, they painted it Yuma green. If they had put in a big tree, they would be looking at a big tree. They put in a Yuma green treated comm tower. And you don't forget, not just the tower, but the repeaters that are on those panel repeaters you see on there need to be color treated too. Otherwise you'll have these little white dots at the end of a tower. You got to do the whole thing. And that's an easy thing to overlook because they'll do what you ask them to do. So if you're not comprehensive in your request, you'll get exactly what you asked for. And now they're looking at their hillside again because it just blends in. I wish I had that in here as a presentation.
Yeah,
piece.
thank you for that.
But I wish I had thought of that. But otherwise they'd be looking at an ungodly looking
Right.
fake tree. So I think about minimal approach. Plus, it's an awful lot cheaper than those things are like $100,000 or whatever, I believe.
So thank you very much, John. We really appreciate it. Our time is up. We have a 15-minute break now, and people are welcome to go to the lobby if they want to, and we will reconvene with Mark and Alicia at 1:45. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Lynn.